Okay, my name is Teresien da Silva. I was born in Portugal, but as a young girl moved to Netherlands, where I studied history at the university. And while I was studying, I was living very near to the Anne Frank House. The Anne Frank House is a museum where a Jewish girl, Anne Frank, was hiding for 25 months. And I felt a strong connection to this story and the history of the Holocaust. So I applied for a job, and that's where I started to work in the museum. Then I worked at the educational department, I made exhibitions, I worked for the international department, I set up the communication department at the Anne Frank House, and the last 20 years I set up a collection and research department. Research is very important. As a historian, it's not so well, how you say that? It's not so strange to really believe in the power of research. We researched a lot about the history of the Frank family and all the other hiders, the helpers, and the historical context in which they were living.
Years?
Yes, in the Anne Frank House, of course, when I started, we were very small. We had 300,000 visitors a year, and that we thought really, well, now with so many visitors, the interest will stop. It will diminish. But the opposite was the case. So from 1984, 1985 on, the amount of visitors increased, and at the moment we have more or less 1 million to 1.3 million visitors. Of course, during COVID it was different, but now it's normal again. And this development meant a lot for the museum itself. And I was part of this development. And we changed the museum contents and the environment of the museum several times in these 38 years that I've worked there. And that's very interesting because when I started to work, the interest in the Holocaust increased worldwide, not only in the Netherlands, but worldwide. Everywhere you saw new films, documentaries about the Holocaust. A lot of survivors were interviewed, and that was also that had also an impact on the interest that people had for the story of Anne Frank. She became more a symbol of the Holocaust, more a symbol of combating racism, anti-Semitism, human rights, the importance of human rights, and she became a symbol of all of that. And so the amount of people who visited the museum increased, and then we discovered that the museum had to change because the annex, the Anne Frank House consists of a front house and an annex. The annex is the part where the Frank family was hidden together with all the other 4 people. And the front house was the part where the helpers worked. So during the day there was a lot of activity in the front house, and at night and in the evening the annex and the hiders could move around a little bit more. Yes. And when I started in the museum, the annex was the most important place to visit. And then we discovered that helpers, so people who really tried to do something to help the people who were persecuted, in our case, the Jewish people, that they needed a lot of more attention. So we reconstructed the office, because that had been changed during the years. as a very modern exhibition space and a documentation center. So we reconstructed everything as it looked like during the hiding period. And that was a very important decision we made, because now when people visit the Anne Frank house, when they have read the diary, they can read the diary and they can recognize the places she describes. Of course, she describes the annex, but she also describes the front house. But because after the office was closed, they used the whole building. And it increased the impact of an original, authentic place. And that's what I think is very important, because the story of the Holocaust, but also the story of the dictatorship in Argentina, is an emotional story, and you better understand and better feel the emotion when you visit the original place, there where it took place. In our case, it's there where Anne Frank wrote her diary. And well, where we are now at Olimpo, I really feel the same thing, that it took place here. Here the suffering of the people without help. They had no help. It's so important to have these places and to preserve these places for the coming generation, who really need to know that people are able to do terrible things to other people, to innocent people. And for me, this place at Olimpo, it's very impressive to visit. And I have been also for a long time a board member of the Auschwitz Committee, the Dutch Auschwitz Committee, and visited a lot of concentration camps, Auschwitz, Birkenau, Sobibor, a lot more. And when I entered Olimpo, I really had a little bit of the same feeling. Wow, now you can better understand what people did to innocent people and how they have suffered. And therefore I think it's so important to maintain these places. And it was a very emotional visit I had here at Olimpo for that reason. Well, we started the research 20 years ago because we are the Anne Frank House, and it's a museum about one person, which is different. So if you have a museum about one person, and of course there were 7 more people in hiding, the whole family Frank and 4 other people, but the importance of this place is because Anne Frank wrote her diary. So we wanted to know everything of her 15 years of life, which is of course not a long life. She died at 15 years in Bergen-Belsen, and we wanted to know everything about the Frank family, everything about the context, the context in which they lived, the historical context, everything about the business of Otto Frank, but also during our research we realized that Anne Frank has been a refugee almost all her life.
Why?
And this is very interesting, I think, because refugee is now a very important topic in the world. We all deal with refugees because at so many places in the world there is war or there is persecution, and people have to flee their country, to leave their country. And for me, during our research, I really discovered that, oh my God, she has been a refugee all her life. Because when she was born in Germany, she had to leave her house because the owner of her house was a Nazi man. So they moved because of that.
Yes.
Then she had to go they fled to Amsterdam, to the Netherlands. Then they tried to go to England in 1936, only 3.5 years later. Then they tried to immigrate to the United States, which was very, very difficult. We researched it because we wanted to know why didn't it succeed. And then finally the war broke out in Holland in 1940. And then they again tried to immigrate to the United States. They were desperate, and then finally they went to hide in the annex. So all those, and then they had to go, they were arrested, and she went to different concentration camps, and then she died. So her whole life was in her, to find a safe place to live is a part of her, was a part of her life. And that was very confronting, as a matter of fact.
Why?
Well, because I never looked at her as a refugee. I looked at her as a Jewish girl that moved to Holland, and then the war broke out, and then they were persecuted. But there was much, much more that happened in the 1930s. It was a difficult period, not only for her parents, but it must have been also very difficult for the children. And well, our research brought all these details up, and we have put everything in a database. That's very important because it's very important with our modern technology to use it.
Yeah.
And everything we researched, all the results were put in a database. And now at the moment, end of this year, it will be published online. Yeah, so everybody can see it and get the results of our research. Well, that's the interesting. Why is Anne Frank so? Why did she become a symbol? Because I think people can identify themselves with this innocent victim. She only became 15 years old, had no influence whatsoever of what was going on around her, politically, socially, whatever, economically, and she became a victim.
Yes.
And I remember that once a girl in South Africa, a black girl in South Africa, read her diary, and she couldn't believe that Anne Frank was white. Because in her experience, only black people were persecuted and not white people. They had the power. So that had an enormous impact, and that's what we see with Anne Frank. Everybody can identify themselves because she writes about or about hiding and what it meant for her and for her development. To be alone and with her, well, of course with the other hiders, but she had to pass through the day, every day, 25 months, it's a long time. And what fear did to her, always living in fear. She developed herself during this hiding period, and she didn't only wrote about what happened, but she also wrote about her personal feelings.
Yes.
And she was very honest about her own development, her personal feelings, and people can identify themselves because we all have the same feelings when in different situations, of course, but our emotions develop at the same way for everybody, as a matter of fact. So we can identify her when she writes about, I want this war to be stopped. We understand her desperate feeling about this. but also about poor. She also wrote about people, the difference between poor and rich, women and men. She wanted to be a writer. She didn't want to lead a life as her mother at home, caring for children. She wanted to be of importance to the world, and that's what made her really. What gave her a face and a voice that so many people in the world can identify with. Well, for us, Anne Frank is a window to the Holocaust. Through the story of Anne Frank, a little innocent girl, we can tell the whole story. We start very small. It's one life, one girl, we tell everything about her, and then we place her story in the context of history, of the Second World War, the growth of National Socialism in Europe, the persecution of the Jews, and it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So through her story we can focus also on the bigger story. And that's a little bit how we work. We all, educationally wise, we also always work with timeline. Yeah. So you have the Second World War and the Holocaust, and you have Anne's life, and how do they interact with each other. That's how we do it. And we also, because for Argentina it's only 40 years ago, for the Holocaust it's almost 80 years ago. So the younger generation has no family anymore who can tell about their personal experiences during this period. Of course they still are, fortunately they still are present, but it's, of course they are between 90, 100 years old, so they're minimized at the moment. And then we notice that we have to give the young people more context to better understand the meaning of the history of Anne Frank in relation to the Holocaust and the Second World War. It's important to give more information. I think that's the difference between Argentina and Europe at the moment, that our history is 40 years older. Because 40 years ago in the Netherlands, when you talk about the Holocaust, you always had a lot of eyewitnesses to tell the story. And of course that's now very, very limited. And then you have to add something. And fortunately we have a lot of interviews done, so they are still able to pass through their experiences. That's very important to have these interviews. But you also need to give more context to better understand the meaning of what happened to, in our case, the little girl Anne Frank. At the Anne Frank house? The visit at the Anne Frank house takes more or less 1 hour.
And the context is brought about throughout the visit or prior to the visit, before the visit?
Well, we have huge websites. Everybody can visit the website. There is a lot of information about Anne's life, about the Holocaust, about a lot of more issues. Our educational work is also transmitted in the website. So people can download a lot of information. We have an audio guide. So they all get an audio guide I think, I don't know, 8 languages, maybe more. And then they go by themselves with the audio guides.
Really?
And then they walk through the front house, and then they go to the annex, and then they go to the room where the original diary is lying, and then we have an exhibition space where we can change exhibitions every year or twice a year about different subjects. It can be a subject about the past, it can be a subject about the present, because we want people to leave the Anne Frank house with the idea that the issues that are important in Anne's life are still important in our present life, present day. So what we have figured out as the tool for the museum are 3 R's. The R of reflection, looking back at the past, response, what do we do when we are in a situation that people are discriminated or persecuted or whatever, and react, what can we do ourselves to improve the world.
Okay, and when school groups visit, do you also do all the visits with the audio guide on their own and then they gather? Or?
No, they first get an introduction.
Yeah.
We have 3 different classrooms where the class can go. We have a lot of school groups coming to the Anne Frank house.
Yes.
School groups from Holland, but also from other countries.
Yes.
So we offer also our educational program in different languages. And first I get a program, and then we explain. They look at films, short films, etc. Then they go to the museum with the audio guides, and then they come back for a discussion. Well, I don't know if when we have a book, a reaction book in the museum. Now it's more
a visit book.
Yeah, a visit book.
Yeah.
And most of the people say never again. So they make the relation to nowadays themselves.
Yeah.
But it depends, of course, how do you relate the past and the present in your museum or on your website. And if you discuss subjects that people do not agree with, then it's more difficult to how you say that? It's more difficult to transmit the importance of that relation between the past and the present. And also you cannot always compare past and present with each other. And we have a lot of discussions about it, because the things that are happening now happen in a very different in a very different time with other challenges. So it's difficult to compare past and present, but still there are mechanisms that you can compare, and it are these mechanisms that can make a difference in life. You have to be very much aware about the mechanisms that can lead to war or discrimination, of persecution of people. And for us that was always very important to emphasize. Be careful. Look, you have to be aware about what's going on in your environment. Nowadays, yeah. But you can't say, oh, what happened then is going to happen again now, because that's too easy. That's not the case. That's not what's going to. It's always different. Things can. War and discrimination and extreme right, etc., always is part of society, and it will never. I'm afraid it will never leave us. But it's important to be aware of the importance of human rights, etc. That you are very much aware of where you stand for, what you stand for. I've interviewed almost 90 people who knew the Frank family, or one of the helpers, or the other hiders, or the people who worked at the office, who worked in the front house of the building where also the people were hiding. And these interviews were made with a professional camera team. And the focus was on different subjects. We wanted to know everything about the person's life.
Yes.
So who are you? How did your life look like?
Yeah.
Especially during the 1930s, the war, and afterwards. Then we focused on the relation with the Frank family, because we have never met them, of course. Except for Otto Frank, the father of Anne, they all died. So for us it's interesting to have a sort of characterization of who these people were. And then we focused on their remembrance. What do you remember of Anne, or Frank, or Margot, or Edith, the mother, or the father, or the helpers, or whatever? Can you tell us everything what you know about their lives and what you have done together? Then we focused on school life, because Anne Frank, well, most of the part she was at school, of course. So about her school life, about living in Amsterdam in that period, what's happened in the 1930s, what happened when Holland was occupied, and what happened when people were disappearing. Because also in the Netherlands the Jewish people were disappearing, like Anne Frank, but not in the way people disappeared here, but they looked for a safe place, a hiding place, or they were taken to a concentration camp. That's also a disappearing.
Yes.
Because nobody knows where they are, what's going on with them, and everybody is afraid that they will be killed. And that's comparison we can make with here, Argentina. And then we focused on the camps, because of course not everybody was sent to the camps, because we interviewed Jewish people and non-Jewish people. So the Jewish people we interviewed who survived told us about either their hiding experience or what they went through in the concentration camps. And then about the return, and then about what Anne Frank means for them today, and what the diary means for them today. And that was always very different, because for some of them they said, well, I'm also an Anne Frank, but nobody is interested in me. Because Anne Frank has become the symbol, and sometimes they feel themselves a little bit unheard.
Yes.
And for other people it's very important that the diary of Anne Frank tells the story that can be compared with other stories, so that it will remain in the remembrance of people what happened during the Holocaust. And these interviews were, well, sometimes we had 2 days of an interview, and sometimes only 4 hours. It depends on the person, their capability of telling their remembrances. It's very different, of course.
How did this experience change you?
Well, I think it's always very difficult to interview people, because you want to know everything, but you ask them to go back in their memories, which they want to forget. So you open wounds, and especially the people who were who survived the concentration camps. And the interview about that part of their lives, it was very, very emotional, because then you feel that they see a film passing by, the film of the concentration camp. And for us, for me as an interviewer, it's always very difficult, because I don't know. I know a lot about books, with what I've read in books, but of course you have not experienced it. And these people have experienced it, and so they smell it again, they see it again, they endure it again. So that was quite emotional. And some people can really talk about all these terrible things they have witnessed, and some survivors cannot tell anything because they really can't. And I don't think it changed me, but I have learned a lot of them. I've learned a lot from them. Because these stories you can never read in a book. You have to hear it from the survivors. And I've been also a few times with survivors back. I went back to the concentration camp and they showed me everything. Yeah, that's unbelievable. It had so much impact. But what I have learned from all those years at the Anne Frank house, I think, is that people never change. People will remain people with their emotions, and it's people can be angry or jealous or whatever, and those emotions really have an impact on how they live. And how they are open for challenges in life, how they react on it. And that's, I think, what I have learned most, that it's so important to control your emotions.
Know them.
All of them, all of them,
We had also thought that it would be interesting for our co-Argentinian workers in sites of memory to learn about the relationship between the state and the Anne Frank's house.
The state?
The state, no, the state of the Netherlands state.
Yeah.
See if there's a relationship. How do you relate to the state?
Okay, well, the Anne Frank house is independent.
Okay.
We are
independent.
Totally independent. Totally independent. Okay. Economically, content-wise, there is officially no relation between the Anne Frank house and the state. But we are also an educational organization.
Yes.
And we depend on subsidy from the government to be able to make educational material.
Yes.
And that relation is very strong because we always have a lot of contact with the government, and they help us developing our educational material. And because Anne Frank is a sort of window to the Holocaust, also for the government, it's very important to help develop our educational mission. And the diary of Anne Frank is owned by the state.
Really?
Yeah. So in that case, we are dependent on the state, because we have the original diaries on permanent loan from the government, and we also have to tell them how we preserve it, and we have to report everything we do about the diaries. So there are different relations with the government, but as a whole we are independent.
And people who visit Amsterdam generally want to go to the Anne Frank's house, like tourists.
Everyone wants to go. Everyone wants to go to the Anne Frank house because everybody knows about Anne Frank, and to see her hiding place, to see the original diaries, to be at the place itself, has such a big impact on people.
Yeah.
So that emotional tour through the Anne Frank house means a lot to people who come, and a lot of them also relate the story of Anne Frank to their own environment or to their own problems or the countries they live in. So I think that's what makes Anne Frank so special, is that it's not only about the Holocaust and the persecution and the hiding. because she writes about so many other things that we all recognize in our own development. Together it makes a very strong story.
Can I ask you something? How was it that the house became a museum? It was the father owned it, or?
Well, the father of Anne Frank rented the house. He rented it for the first time in December 1940. Already the Netherlands was occupied, so that's quite special that he really had confidence that he could continue working and continue living in Amsterdam, so he rented the building. Then he returned from the camps in 1945, the only one of the 8 people in hiding. And then he went to live with with 2 helpers, because everything was gone. They gave him the diary of Anne Frank, and he started reading. The helpers gave him the diary because they found it when they were arrested. They gave it to him. It was very emotional, of course. Then he let other people read some parts of it. Look what my daughter wrote, how special. And then suddenly somebody told him, you have to publish it. It's very important to publish it. And it was published in 1947. And then it was translated in French, in English, in American, in a lot of other languages. And then people rang the bell. He still worked there at the office after the war. They rang the bell and they wanted to see the annex. So he gave personal guide to those people.
So he was still renting?
He was still working there. And in the meantime, after the diary was published in so many languages, he noticed that people had a lot of interest in visiting the place where they were hiding.
Yes.
And then the building was very, very old, and he was not the owner. He bought it, but he could not afford the preservation of the building. It was too old, so he had to sell it again.
Right.
And then the building was to be demolished, break down.
Yes.
And then the people from the resistance and the mayor of Amsterdam and Otto Frank, they stood up and said, we have to do something. This building with this history cannot be demolished. And then they started a fundraise, and the United States, Netherlands, all different countries gave money to be able to buy the building. And that's what happened. They could buy it for just 1 guilder. That's nothing. It was more or less a gift. And because the building has to be given to an organization, the Anne Frank House was set up.
Yeah, so interesting.
And then 4 years, this was in 1957, and then 3 years later, the museum was opened. And they did the 3 years they worked on the preservation of the building and to prepare it to open it as a museum, but only the annex. And later we changed. The annex always remained the same, but then we changed the museum content and the experience in the front house. We changed it. And of course you need museum facilities, because when we opened for the first time in 1960, we had 9,000 visitors, sorry. And now we have 1.3 million, so your museum facilities have to be improved. And that's also during the years what we did. Otto Frank also had a big influence, of course, on the development of the Anne Frank House until his death in 1980. He was very much involved, and so that's also a survivor. But when he died, because we were independent, we continued as an independent organization.
Well,
For me personally, the importance of historical places mean more for me than a museum with an exhibition somewhere. It's also very important that they exist because they give content and they can be very well done. But for me personally, to visit a place where the atrocities took place, where people suffered, really there where I'm standing, for me it's it has an enormous impact because you can't come closer. You can't come closer to what happened than to be on that spot where it really happened. And so for me, Olimpo was I didn't know that it existed, to say the truth. And it was very impressive, very, very impressive. It felt like, as if it just happened yesterday. No, my husband, Eric. Okay. He is the exhibition specialist. I only worked at the Anne Frank House, and as a board member of the Auschwitz committee, I helped making the exhibition in Auschwitz about what happened in the Netherlands, because in Auschwitz all the countries have their own barrack, and they can tell the story of the persecution of Jewish or in that barrack. So I helped with that. But no, you forget it because that's really his speciality. For me, it's For me, I've really worked at the Anne Frank House, and I've done a lot of exhibitions about Anne Frank.
Yes.
But only about Anne Frank.
Not only, it's not an accurate word. It's a lot. Not only, but a lot.
Yeah.
And you have told us about her being an icon, and you have shown us a display of T-shirts and ways in which she became a symbol of resilience or resistance.
Yeah, icons can really help because they survive.
Yes, I can tell you that.
Yeah, they have obtained a position, a symbolic position. That makes them that makes it possible that people can identify themselves with that person. And when you identify yourself with one person, you also identify yourself with the history of that person and where he or she stands for. And that's also in the same time the difficult about icons, because icons become so big that people know, they see it, they recognize it, they know maybe the name, but not always they know what's behind, what's the personal story about.
That person.
And because the influence of the press, of a lot of other things, also the remembrance of these persons can change during the years. And it can be either remembrance of the Holocaust or of something else.
Yes.
And that makes it difficult. Iconization of a person is not always positive. But I think that I really believe that it's more positive than negative.